Thank you, Donna, for reading that miracle story. And now, if you wouldn't mind making sense of it for the congregation, I'd appreciate it. Wow. So we have this story where Elijah comes across this widow in the outlying areas and says to her, "Will you make me a meal? I'm hungry. A loaf and some wine." And she says, "I have nothing." And we were just going to eat. I was just going to make the last meal with the last bit of flour that I have, and for my son and I to eat, and then we would ourselves wait for death. But she says, "All right, I'll make you a meal." And she does that. And lo and behold, from that time on, her meal never ends. She always has a supply of meal, and she always has a supply of oil for her lamp. So, what do you do with that story? Well, I want to set a bit of context this week. As you know, we're dealing with the stories of Elijah and Elisha for the whole month of October. And so we'll have a little bit of a chance to talk about what these stories mean. But let me give you some background, because without it, it does not make sense. So, how many of you have heard of King David? How about King Solomon? All right, how about King Ahab? Oh, wow, that's an amazing number of people. So, King Ahab is the seventh king. Comes far down the line after David and Solomon. But King Ahab, well, first, the kings after King Solomon turned out to not be such good kings. And bit by bit, they saw the unified kingdom that David and Solomon had created broken apart. And in the northern part, there was the kingdom of Israel, and in the southern part, there was the kingdom of Judah. The north was very poor by the time Ahab comes along. The south had grown increasingly rich. Do you see the seeds of conflict here? And Ahab was an even more corrupt king than what some of them had been. And so here he was in Israel, and he is trying to take more and more from these increasingly poor people, of whom the widow represents. We know from our present day life, when people live under that kind of oppression and poor government, there will be an uprising. Right? Those of you who think that Scripture is not political, you should probably let yourself go home now, because you'll just be frustrated, and then after you make your views known to me, I'll be frustrated. Because this is a very political situation. It is into this situation with the corrupt king, the increasingly starving population, and Ahab has lost control of them, And there comes out of the wilderness, practically, a prophet by the name of Elijah. Now, in our system of government, we would call him the opposition party. That's the role of the prophet, to be the opposition, loyal or not loyal. There springs up in ancient Israel, when it seems that it is really needed, someone who has a voice that can name what is happening and can confront the power. These prophets, Elijah being one of the most prominent of the early prophets, he comes to Ahab and he says, "You are corrupt. Your people are starving, and you do nothing. You have married a foreign wife, Jezebel." You've heard about her before. You've married this foreign wife, and instead of trying to make life better for your own people, you are making alliances with Jezebel's people. And you are moving us towards Jezebel's religion and politics. Stop that, Elijah says. Stop it in the name of God, a God of justice, and feed your people. Well, Elijah has to retreat. You won't be surprised after he delivered that message to Ahab. Ahab turns his forces against Elijah, and Elijah flees, and he goes out into the countryside, and there he encounters a woman who represents exactly the people he was talking about and for whom he is advocating. What do we make of this story? Of her flour never disappears, and there's oil in her lamp because of her encounter with Elijah. I'm so nervous about miracle stories. I want to suggest to you that this story is again a spiritual story, that they put characters around, but that it carries a spiritual message that is not about the people, but is about the promise of God. And so if it is not Elijah, the person who comes to this woman, what if it is the prophetic voice? The voice that cries for justice. The voice that confronts power. And this poor woman represents the poor people. And what the passage is meant to tell us is that when there is a prophetic word that is spoken to power, when that is happening, the people will be fed. They will be fed perhaps not flour and oil, but they will be fed hope. And hope is what can keep us alive regardless of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so this prophetic presence comes into the life of this poor widow and her son, and her life is changed, and she has hope. In the story, they say it is the hope that comes in the form of bread and oil. Hope comes in many forms. I was trying to think, and this is a question for you. Is it possible in our day that we hear prophetic voices and they come and the voices in our midst and we are fed by hope? How about Malala? Doesn't she give us hope for the leadership of the next generation? What about Greta? Last night I was reading Matthew Fox's words that he said to the Vatican, his 95 Theses, and he posted them in the 1980s. And the people who were oppressed and silenced in the church had hope. And now they have Pope Francis, who, although he's not perfect, is addressing some of the issues that are before the church in ways that have been unseen previously. The voice of the prophet often does not happen quickly. And people still can starve to death physically. But spiritually, when you hear someone come who has a perspective that cuts through a lot of the muddiness of power, we are heartened. So I wonder today, and I'd be interested to hear your views, are whistleblowers prophets? Right? Like, have we changed the name? Because Elijah spoke truth to King Ahab at great personal peril. Do we sometimes in our society call whistleblowers or call prophets by the name of whistleblower? I don't know. Talk to me about that. Talk to each other about that. I don't want to say everything because we have lots of important stuff to do in our service today. So I want to end it here with this introduction to the situation that Elijah and the prophet who comes after him, whom he mentors, Elisha. I just want to give you this introduction. If you want to read more about them, well, just Google them. Thank you very much for listening and for holding on to your questions until next week when we again hear from Elijah and Elisha.